Understand the following, believers. Every mass deception needs two things to work: collaborators and victims. I'll explain it by using the example of the Jim Jones tragedy. Jim Jones was this charismatic figure who started a cult, and the people of this cult ended up committing suicide together. It's a while back, I believe from the 1970s. It was big news back then. Now, in the example of Jim Jones, this man was a deceiver. Absolutely. He tricked the people into believing he was some special anointed man of God. Now, for those that know the Bible, for those that are Christ-centered, they know how to examine whether someone is truly appointed by the Heavenly Father or not. People that are not Christ-centered have difficulty examining this. But even those without Christ can sometimes see when someone is a deceiver or not. Now, most of the people encountered Jim Jones knew this man was out of his mind. But there were a few people that were fragile and vulnerable due to trauma and neglect from the community. And it's those community victims that Jim Jones preyed upon. People that were abandoned by their families, people that were emotionally neglected by their friends and the community, people that were scapegoats, people that were in need and not helped nor ministered to by their communities. Those were the community victims that Jim Jones tricked into his movement. And then you had people who knew what Jim Jones was doing and just got along to get some benefits, whether it was sexual benefits, financial benefits. And look, it all worked. At some point, many of the people at Jim Jones' church realized, something is wrong over here. Many of the community victims that Jim Jones preyed upon realized this is wrong and they left. Others, they didn't want to face something was wrong and they became collaborators. So they were in on the scam. And at some point, the collaborators lost their mind and they committed suicide with Jim Jones. Now, hold on a minute. I need to research this, whether Jim Jones actually died in suicide or he was killed later on. But anyway, there was a mass suicide. Now, are those people who died in this mass suicide, are they victims? Most of them were not. Because at the point of committing suicide, you realize, hold on a minute, how come Jesus wants me to end my life? What is this? At that point, a lot of victims realized, I'm out of here. But the people they became collaborators because they didn't want to face reality, they became delusional. And they worked against their own long-term interests. Now, an example of Jim Jones is something that happened a while ago. We can clearly see that society had victims and that Jim Jones took advantage of those victims. You get me? Now, because some of society's victims became collaborators, they became guilty by participating in Jim Jones' cult, and they died, society was relieved that we don't have to take responsibility for how we treated those people. And that's why society allows mass deception. Society allows mass deception because society knows that their victims that they've neglected will finally feel at home in those cults. And when those cults further victimize those victims, now society can point a finger at those cults. Society can say, Jim Jones was such a bad guy for treating all those people into suicide. Or they would say, that weird church over there is evil because they tricked all those people. Okay. But those people that ended up in those churches, many of them were looking for answers in life. Answers society couldn't offer. Well, society can't give answers, just realize that they're not God. They don't have all the answers. Now, a lot of the people tricked into those cults are victims. That's true. And society is relieved because now They can blame the cult for the people they've neglected. But here's the thing. Both in society, as well as in those cults, at some point, the people that are victimized realize this is wrong. And once they realize something's wrong, they will get out sooner or later, often soon. People that stay become collaborators. And apart from the victims, you also have people who don't want to be victimized, so they get along with the victimizers just to be left alone. So you have two types of collaborators. You have those who join the victimizers from the start out of fear of being victimized themselves. They're just cowards. And then you have the victims who also become cowards because they want to face how much they've been taken advantage of. So they become collaborators and keep things quiet. Those are the two types of collaborators that exist. So understand this. Mass deception can never happen without the consent of society. Society consents to mass deception because mass deception is their way of bail themselves out of taking responsibility and accountability for their communities. And those cults are actually in agreement with society. Every cult out there, it doesn't matter how ridiculous their beliefs are, as long as they are in existence and are operating and recruiting members, society is in on it. If you have a cult that believes in raping little babies, then you would see very quickly that cult will be shut down. Because it's too disturbing for people. If you have a cult that believes in, torturing children openly, you'll see very quickly that people will shut it down. Because it's too obvious. If society tolerates that, everyone will see how evil society is. Society will shut it down. Now, but if you have a cult that does believe in raping children or torturing little children, but they do it behind the scenes, and in the front, they come with some weird idea. For example, that aliens will come to save us, whatever, or there's some big spaghetti monster to worship. It doesn't matter how ridiculous the external beliefs are of the cult. As long as the external beliefs are not too shocking, society will be in on it. And if they commit violent and hurt and horrible crimes behind the scenes, as long as they remain behind the scenes, society will look the other way. It's only when their dirt comes to the light, the society will do something about it. But just realize this. Those cults out there with their mass deception, society is in on it. Maybe you have this weird church that believes in aliens, but one thing you notice is that most of the women that attend that church are sexually loose. And because they're sexually loose, those women believe that it's their duty to relieve the men of their sexual frustration. So those women would dress in sexually provoking ways, and they would go to clubs, to pubs, to churches, everywhere, and they will become lewd to many of the men. By them doing this, society avoids one explosion, namely men with sexual anger losing it. Worldly men with sexual anger, when they lose it, people will get hurt. That's how it goes. So by having this weird church with those women being sexually loose, that weird church helps society escaping a bunch of men exploding. Or let's say you have this feminist group where all the women there kind of rage against men all the time. Now, when female reprobates don't get attention or don't get any significance from the group, they explode. And when they explode, they harm the community. So to prevent those female reprobates from exploding all over the place, society has this cult that validates the anger of female reprobates. So now all the female reprobates are there together. You see how far this goes? Every cult out there that you see operating and recruiting members, society is in on it. There's some type of explosion or bad consequence that society wants to avoid. And this cult helps them in avoiding it. Maybe you have a lot of orphans in the community, and those orphans realize that the community abandoned them. And those orphans now are grown people with anger against the community. Now, the community doesn't want those grown folks who've been abandoned now to take it out of the community. So now, you have those gangs in the street. And those criminal gangs, when those orphans are little children, they recruit them. And then those gangs begin to fight one another. What's the purpose here? Those orphans were abandoned by the community. The community allowed the parents to abandon them. So the community is guilty and responsible for the mental issues that those children develop. When those children are adults, it's going to escalate in the community because those grown adults have proof against the community. But now, because the children were recruited by those drug cartels, and the drug cartels organized fights in which meant those teenage orphans die, now society doesn't have to face the fact they've abandoned many of their own people because they would say, well, they joined gangs, so they brought it on themselves, or well, they were brainwashed by the gangs, so the gangs are responsible, so now the community doesn't have to face their own neglect. So, mass deception requires two things: victims and collaborators. Unfortunately, there are victims who are cowards and will turn to the dark side and become collaborators. But now you know it. There is no mass deception out there without society being in on it. There's some type of short-term benefit the public gets out of it. And that's why I've told you before, examine those movements out there. There are even churches out there where nothing but satanic diversions so that the public doesn't have to face themselves. There are many of them. I'm telling you, any cult out there that's operative, recruiting members, society is in on, society gives them a license to do it. Why is it that when believers fellowship with one another, they are under attack? People come after them. But when you have cults that believe in spaghetti monsters, or you have cults that believe in aliens come to Satan, you have cults believing in weird sexual doctrines, society allows it to happen. Because society is in on it. I'm telling you, society is in on it. And often society is aware of the sexual abuse and the sexual violence and all the harm that happens behind the scenes. But society doesn't want to deal with it. Because society is relieved from seeing it. If it's out of sight, it's out of your mind. That's how society operates. That's why when you are a whistleblower and you reveal all these things, society turns on you. Society calls you a conspiracy theorist, or they call you a maniac, or try to discredit you. You know why? Because by you bringing all these dark things to the light, you force society to take action against it, and you also will reveal how society was in on it all the time. Look, if a child was sexually molested somewhere at school, and the teacher was arrested, it can be people didn't know about it. It was something that happened suddenly. If the teacher was a new teacher, or if the victimization was less than, if the victimization only lasts for like a few weeks, it can be the case. But if multiple children have been sexually molested by the same teacher in a school, impossible that nobody else knew about it. When this comes out, people are going to ask, well, Donovan, how can this man have the time to molest all those children? And didn't the parents of the children realize something's wrong with my child? They didn't realize the children had traumas, the mood of children changed. So the parents ignored warning signals. So the parents became collaborators of what's going on with their child. Even if the parents were not aware that sexual abuse was going on to the child, because the parents refused to look into it, they became collaborators. And there were also other people who realized it, but they didn't want to speak out because they didn't want to get in trouble. Well, they couldn't give anonymous tips or give anonymous reports. They could have hinted towards it. They didn't even do that. And sometimes even law enforcement looks the other way. So if it was just one kid that was sexually molested and lost for a short term, okay, that can be logical that people didn't know about what's going on. But if it's a bunch of children and it happens over and over again, it's bullshit. People say they didn't know about it. So anytime a scandal from the community comes out, it will reveal that people were in on it. So whenever you have whistleblowers or truth seekers who reveal things, whether believers or not, people turn against them. People want to be left alone and be at ease all the time without having to face any difficulties or any challenge in life. That's how worldly people are. And they collaborate with one another to shut down anyone who disrupts their ease. If you disrupt their ease, it doesn't matter whether you are a good guy or a bad guy, they turn on you. And if you reveal facts that incriminates them, then they will play the victim or play the hero just to bail themselves out. That's how worldly people are. And that's why believers should not be fellowshipping with worldly people. Because worldly people, in the long run, they enable all the violence on the earth, because they refuse to submit to Christ and comply with the solution. Look, if someone is not walking by faith, doing the will of the Heavenly Father, that means they are collaborating with darkness. Now, you still have victims in the world who don't know any better. Those victims, for them, there is hope. They can, once they wake up, eventually, because they're realistic, they become believers. But you also have a lot of people who turn to the dark side to escape. Look, people that persist in darkness, I'm not talking about people who just walk in darkness. All of us were in darkness. Okay, all of us. We were born in a fallen state, and consequently, we were in darkness till the day we became born again. All of us were darkness at some point. But the moment someone realizes something is wrong and they refuse to even look for better, from that point on, they become a collaborator. Okay, they're not the one doing all the atrocities, but they are enabling the atrocities because they don't even admit something is wrong. If they admit something is wrong, now they have shed the light that something is wrong, and now this will influence the situation for the better. Now people can look for what's wrong and look for a solution. But the moment you don't even want to admit something is wrong, you're in on it. Satan can't do anything on the earth without collaborators. So, not everyone that's victimized is a victim. Collaborators are victimized also. But they end up victimized because they invested in evil, and now evil turned on them. And those collaborators always thought that they were the exception. They're not. Now, if someone had no idea what they were dealing with, and they end up victimized, that's different. But when people know what they're dealing with, and they just think they're the exception, and just want to be left alone, well, when things backfire, it's just a backfire. They're not the victim. They are the collaborator that's not facing a backfire. Look, not everyone out there is a collaborator. Absolutely not. But we do have a lot of collaborators amongst us. So, beware you don't endorse a collaborator. Victims, you minister onto them from a distance. And you tell them, listen, whatever happened to you, you can't undo it. Yes, people are to blame for what they did to you or allowed to happen to you. But you focusing on their blame is not going to help you. You need to be better. Victims you can minister onto. Collaborators you avoid. Once someone has become a collaborator, once you realize they are a collaborator, then peacefully avoid them. As simple as that. You're not going to avoid victims, because when you avoid victims, you become a collaborator that allow bad things to continue. I'm not telling you to bring all victims to your house and to look after them. No. But I'm saying you can pray for victims, at least at a distance. You can invest in the community for the better. Such things you do. I'm not telling you to minister to every victim you encounter, because you don't have the human capacity to do that. You don't. If there are 2 million victims in a country, you can't talk one-on-one with all 2 million victims. That's not possible. But you can make a YouTube channel, or you can pray, decree. You can do something that will contribute to better. That's what you do. And if possible, you minister to the victim one-on-one. Okay? So victims you can minister to at arm's length. Collaborators you avoid. Never confuse a collaborator for a victim. Once you see a collaborator as a victim, you have put yourself and other people in harm's way. A collaborator you avoid. That's why you need to examine every situation. You need to look at the bigger picture. Because too often, we treat victims as collaborators. We blame the victim because we don't want to deal with stuff. Stop blaming the victim as if the victim is a collaborator. Okay? A victim is a victim. A collaborator is a collaborator. Know the difference. If you don't know the difference, you need to look at yourself and you need to increase your knowledge. You need to pray, and so that the Father will give you knowledge on how to discern it. Victims you minister onto. Collaborators you avoid. Well, that's it for now. Keep it on with Christ, be at peace, and I'll see you in my upcoming live stream.